I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. So I currently am situated on the unceded, stolen, and occupied territory of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kakite, and Tsawwassen First Nations. This is also known as colonially as Surrey, BC. Um, I'm gonna do a pretty quick land acknowledgement because I think land acknowledgements are kind of a bare minimum. And I want to emphasize the role of decolonization, um, not just acknowledging that we're on stolen land. So something that I want to be doing is just intertwining decolonization into my presentation because decolonization is something that should be intertwined into everything we do, not just the beginning. Um, yeah, and also like quick points is just decolonization is very intertwined with climate justice, as we know, and people have said, but it's also important that we stand with the most marginalized. Our liberation has to begin with and be centered around uplifting Indigenous communities, and hopefully we can continue to be good stewards of the land. I want to, and actually, we'll do intros, and so I'll ask where everybody is from. But one last point I'll quickly touch upon is that urban planning and decolonization and stolen land have a lot of links, actually. Oh, actually, there's a few more people coming in. Should have waited a few more minutes to start. It's okay. Um, yeah, so they actually have a lot of links, and I'll be touching on this later in the presentation as well, but Um, if you think that maybe like indigeneity and the city are not, or like are counterintuitive, that's not true. Because indigenous people cannot be erased from the urban. It's a relationship that has a lot of contention, and like I said, I talked about Surrey, and it's on six different territories, and so you can see in that example how a colonial city structure very much like contradicts and contrasts indigeneity and like the people who additionally or who have been on this land for time immemorial. And then yeah, thinking about Toronto or Tunkarundu, but how it's very different in this acknowledgement of traditional indigenous territory. Um, I would invite you all to think about that. Um, and then we'll do intros in a little bit so we can talk about where everyone's from then. And then yes, yeah. We just started, don't worry. So here I am, a little bit about me. I am a second generation Bangladeshi settler. Um, and I think that also ties into what I was talking about before with our land acknowledgement because I, my family is displaced from Bengal because of British colonialism and actually a lot of the history of like the Industrial Revolution and like city making is very tied into Bengal, and I'll touch on that later, but just really wanted to quickly touch on that now. I'm an artist. I've mainly been a climate justice and community organizer. It's kind of weird to call myself a climate justice organizer. I don't know why it feels weird, but I think it just has a certain connotation. But I very much love climate justice organizing. I just think it very much encompasses a very broad field of things. I graduated from UBC this year, and I'm applying to an urban planning master's right now. Hopefully, I get in. Hopefully, I put this on my on my application. So, and I also used to be a cooperative developer at Solid State, which is a incubator in Surrey that works to give agency and provide agency through worker cooperatives and other solidarity economy forms in Surrey, BC as well. That's a little about me. And then, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about space guidelines and what I want to bring to this space. And I'm going to invite you guys to add your own if you have any. Firstly, I want to say that learning is circular and not hierarchical. So I am not an expert by any means. I just have a lot of experience doing community work at the local level, at the municipal level. Something I forgot to say in my intro is that when I was 18, I really wanted to run for city council and I went to feminist campaign school. Um, it was a whole thing. But um, have come to realize since then, I'm 22 now, so that was 4 years ago, a little bit about how important community organizing is at a local level, but also at a grassroots level. But again, I'm not an expert. If there's anything I say that's wrong or anything that you disagree with, I'd love to know. Secondly, I would like to ask everyone to take space, make space. No worries that everyone's camera's off. I do have some discussion points for everyone or discussion questions, but you can engage with those in the chat or on a Miro board that I have. I would love to hear you guys talk. And for the discussion parts, we're not going to be recording, so the session itself is recorded, but the discussion ports won't be uploaded anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. Third, I asked that you be present. I know I always do this, so it's okay. But I always go on my phone during Zoom meetings, or I do split screen. That's usually what I do. I would love it if you didn't. I put a lot of effort into this presentation and these slides. Um, that being said, take care of do what you need to do. If you need to doodle, I try to doodle instead of doing split screen. If you need to fidget, if you need to lay on your back, no one's gonna know. Um, yeah. And then lastly, I would love if people participated, but at whatever level you can offer. So even if that's just like reactions or participating in the chat, you definitely don't have to speak. Um, yeah. And then quickly, just accessibility. Are the captions on? I think the captions are on. And then the slides will be shared with you guys all afterwards. Oh, and then if you want to put like T in the chat, if you want me to explain anything, usually when I've done workshops in the past, they have been a little less academic. This one, I will have some academic terms in there. Um, I I did this because I don't think accessibility means a lack of academia. It just means translating these concepts into understandable terms. I will do my best to explain, but if something is unclear, please, please, please let me know. You can always privately message me as well if you don't want to say it to everyone. But please don't feel shy on my account. Everyone benefits from more clarity, and I'm sure there are other people who are confused if you are. There's going to be a break in the middle of this, and also the session is recorded, and the discussion sessions, I said this before, will be taken out. So, yeah. And then, obviously, if you need anything during the call, water, bathroom, take care of your needs as well. Yeah, so the agenda for today, it's going to be four broad sections. Firstly, it's interacting with local community. Second is urban planning, decolonization, and neoliberalism. Third is mutual aid. And fourth is visioning for a better community. I'm excited to get started. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit from you guys who've joined. Um, Yes, thank you for putting that in the chat. Yeah, if you want to put your name, pronouns, or I guess your name kind of shows up if you want to do the chat, or if you want to speak, you can speak. Where you're calling in from, how will you be participating? So if you're just going to be talking in the chat, or if you'll be speaking, I'd love to know just for my own reference. And what is one thing you love about scared if people don't want to talk as much, but I would love if anyone has any ideas about what basketball could have to do with climate justice. I know this seems a little left field, but if you have any potential thoughts, I would love to hear them. Okay. Teamwork, coordination, organizing, strategy. Okay, it's a very like actual, yeah, I agree. We bounce back. Oh, I like these. Yeah, these are good. Um, We definitely do these things in climate justice and basketball. Okay. You guys keep saying your things. Oh, working towards a common goal. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess this is, yeah, it's interesting that this is how it's getting interpreted, which is, it's a very open-ended question. Um, keep it coming, keep it coming. Oh, I see people are liking these. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna start talking about my thoughts on this. So Climate Recentered, which I actually forgot to name in my introduction, so I will do that now. Um, Part of what I've been doing and why I wanted to do this workshop is Climate Recentered is an organization that I co-founded 5 years ago now, when I was 18 or 4 years ago. And it is a group of BIPOC femme who are all from so-called Surrey, who've been born and raised there. And we've all seen how the differences. So like Surrey, if you don't know, it's very close to Vancouver. And living in proximity to such a big city versus like a city where it's like endemically under-resourced and all of the immigrants move here, or most of the immigrants move here. And there's a very big wealth disparity between Surrey and Vancouver. And so seeing all these different things, we wanted to start something that also acknowledges this and like the lived experience of BIPOC folk and working towards climate justice. And so a lot of what we do is working within our city, within the people who we've been knowing for a very long time. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna read. Okay, sounds good. Thank you for joining, Monby. Um, and so we've been doing a lot of things. We've done a lot of events. We had an event with Naomi Klein. We've had we had a lot of events, and the most favorite event, oh my gosh, meeting people where they're at. It's almost like that comes later. Um, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. My favorite event that Climate Recentered has ever hosted is a basketball tournament. And I'll talk a little bit about why we did that. So, this basketball tournament was the byproduct of a community research project that we did in 2022, where we dissected links between climate change and city planning in high schools and elementary schools, and also in our community groups. We had a guiding question, which was if you could build anything in your city, what would it be? We received a lot of responses, but one that really stuck out to us, and we asked this to hundreds of people across Surrey, and this ranged from people who were basketball players to people who were senior citizens to South Asian aunties to Filipino community members. But one response that really stuck out to us when we were doing it in high schools is this one boy said that he would convert the extraordinary amount of parking lots in the city of Surrey into basketball courts. Um, he said that too many of the courts were cracked, have missing nets, have broken hoops, or are overcrowded. And at the same time, parking lots in Surrey are underused. And this, I think, represents very clearly how car-centric infrastructure that is not conducive to climate was really shaping the city of Surrey and the place that we live in. So our tournament was actually held in a parking lot, in a church parking lot that like doubled as a basketball court, that was used in its off days. And this allowed us to engage with new demographics, kind of meeting people where they're at mentality, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then, but I think more clearly, it helps us look at who has the right to public space and like what gets prioritized. Is it something that's good for people's health and good for building community, specifically community for almost predominantly like racialized boys, versus like car-centric activity or like also in Surrey, there's a lot of and like in North America, there's a lot of corporate buildings that are heavily underused and underutilized. So understanding the spatial links of our society and what happens can be really clearly seen through something like basketball because it's so simple, but um, it I think reveals a lot about society. Claire, yeah, you can go.
This actually reminded me another story about basketball where on a call a couple years ago, someone was talking about how they're from a community that um, is impacted by wildfires year after year pretty severely. And one of their goals is always to rebuild the basketball courts because it was such a joy bringer, especially after such a hard time. So I don't know, it's basketball again. Woohoo. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. No, the joy aspect of it is really important to Climate Recentered as well because we did really want to start something that celebrated joy because of like such dominant narratives of like climate doomism. But something where you have a basketball tournament actually is climate activism, and we really wanted to recenter what climate justice organizing looks like and also just honor the work that like indigenous communities and racialized communities have been doing since existence. And yeah. Um, and then I'm gonna move to the next slide, but I'm still gonna talk about this. So also with basketball, something that we see and also just with the community spaces in general is that there aren't too many places to socialize, especially for marginalized people. So asking the question of like where can racialized low-income youth go to hang out? Where I used to hang out at the mall, which like I feel like a lot of youth in suburbia do, but is also very something that's very intricately linked with capitalism and consumerism. And so through this basketball tournament, we were able to see spatial outcomes of racial capitalism, which is to say all capitalism, because capitalism is built off of racism, since its inception. The EIC, the VOC, these capitalist companies, the Dutch company and the East Indian Company were very much built off colonialism and racism. So, but how does the right to space intersect with race and class? Who is invited to play? If you think of something like who are you inviting if you set up a tennis court versus a basketball court? And what does that mean? Um, Yeah, because you're inviting very different crowds and creating a safe place and creating placemaking for very different people. So at this tournament, and also at this tournament, we were playing music really, really loudly, and we definitely had a big presence. And in response to this, we heard from racialized boys, particularly Black community members, how if they did this without our presence, like that's not something they would feel especially comfortable with because of how they appear as a threat to the state and to police. And so it is important to ask these questions, important to say who is included and excluded in public spaces and how can we work with marginalized community rather than how can we work with marginalized community essentially. Um, And then I really like this quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a very amazing abolitionist and scholar. Um, Capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. And so the implementation of basketball courts can indicate spatial outcomes of racial capitalism. Um, yeah. And so when we think of urban planning, don't just think of the trends. I think it's kind of been a trendy thing recently. Um, Don't they, I know those like about here videos by Ute, like a lot of people see those, which are really good videos. I love him and I love his videos. But also understand that urban planning is about the geographical and societal ways space is shaped. And this is very intertwined with climate because it's like, how do we choose to use the spaces? How are they being served? How do they harm the communities that we're in? All of these things. So the key takeaway of this section is to get people to play basketball. I'm joking, I'm joking. The key takeaway of this action is to meet people where they're at and to take action in meaningful, sustainable, and joy-inducing ways. Um, yeah. Okay, so something I also wanted to touch upon in connecting with community. So after Climate Recentered's big community research project, we decided what we wanted to do was have a festival. And so this festival is actually at my old high school, where we gave out 400 bags of free groceries in under half an hour. Um, and we had a repurposed clothing store. It was kind of a pay what you can model, but we had donated clothing. We also had local BIPOC owned businesses come in booth. We had local organizations who were committed to social justice, and we had live performances from local artists. We also had a bubble tea stand. Just wanted to add that in. And you might think, what does this have to do with climate? But it actually is quite relevant in terms of celebrating joy, but also free grocery stores. As climate disasters wreak agricultural systems worldwide, food instability accelerates, the cost of groceries is at an all-time high, while corporate grocers rake in profits. Reports say that over half of all produce in Canadian grocery stores is lost and wasted annually. And on top of that, millions and tons of produce are thrown away yearly that could be redistributed. And so we actually did partner with grocery stores to get their excess food waste and tried to give it to community instead. And the fact that it was gone so fast, I think really marks that this was something that is needed. And since then, Climate Recentered has done more free grocery pop-ups at the SkyTrain. And every time we do it, the groceries are gone very fast. Also, fashion, every year, the fast fashion industry does so much damage to the environment, and also does not treat its workers very well. And despite the overproduction of clothing, there is still 1 in 6 Canadians who cannot afford new clothes, especially with the way thrift stores be acting these days. Why everything is so expensive. I am shocked because they get the clothes for free. And so having a free second-hand clothing store really helps make sure that these clothes don't go to waste. All right. Before we move on to the next section, is there any questions, any comments? Yeah. What I just really want to emphasize about this part is that like Climate Recentered is trying to meet people on a local level and do things at a community level and things where you're benefiting your community really help benefit and build a community base that can respond to the climate crisis. Um, but I'll touch on that later on. Okay. Section 2, urban planning, decolonization, and neoliberalism. So I have the definitions. If anyone read the handout or the pre-meeting material that I gave out, I did include these in there, but I wanted to quickly touch on it in case you didn't get a chance to. I know some people signed up yesterday as well. So neoliberalism, also, I will preface this. Neoliberalism is a very broad topic. It changes a lot. There's books about the definition of neoliberalism. This is the definition that I have for you today. Um, Neoliberalism can be described as a market rule ideology, describes projects and systemic practices of deregulated capitalism operating across various levels. It can be seen through heavy privatization, anti-progressive taxation, prioritization of individual consumer choice and availability. So having a lot of choices, individualization, consumerism, that's kind of what that means. Cuts in social services, austere governments. Austerity means that you have a kind of tight government that doesn't want to spend money. Or I think austere governments are a little bit of a myth in the sense that the governments will spend money for the free market, but they won't spend money on social services. And economic growth becomes the top priority. Sounds like the Ontario. Yes. And then, yes, the Ontario Gov. Yeah. Yes, yes. We are, and also like globally a neoliberal time, and neoliberalism has really spurred as a market ideology since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came into power, which was in the 80s, 70s. Um, Margaret Thatcher is famously called Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher because one of the first things that she did when she got in as the UK Prime Minister was to cut the free milk services at schools. Yeah. And then neocolonialism, which I won't talk about as much, but I think is still important to acknowledge because people talk about colonialism a lot, but I think it's shifted, and I think neocolonialism is a better term. So neocolonialism refers to a system of relationships and tactics which imperial powers employ when direct domination is not possible. So even if countries are independent, countries like Bangladesh and India, former and new colonial powers act implicitly rather than explicitly to either continue or forge neocolonial relations, neocolonial exploit relations and exploitation while asserting political influence. So one really common example of this is people providing aid. So post-partition in India, Amer India was facing very big famine, and so America gave them aid on the condition that they become very neoliberal and become very free market oriented because they were trying communism. And so you can see how it's aid, but it's something that's very conditional and ultimately serves the new colonial power. It's not something where it's like the British come and they steal your land. Well, they do, but just a little under the cover. I do think like neocolonialism is colonialism. I want to make that clear. It's just refers to the ways that colonialism has shifted in the past century. Any questions about that? Okay. Um, I forgot to. So, okay. Thank you. And then a city. So I talk a lot. I feel like we don't, what is a city? So we've talked a lot about like neoliberalism. But a city is also important to note, like the prominence of cities and like cities being kind of the center of life is really intertwined with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution kind of shifted our society, our world in a very different way. Um, it made the production focused on cities in England and etc. and in London, um, where the power lies in the owning class. And so cities became sites of surplus capital. And this is something that continues to happen today. Cities get reinvested in as sites of surplus capital, which what that means is that it's economic growth. Like it's where you can have excess capital and excess money that can again be used and used and used for further economic growth. And then also something I want to say is that cities are being made and remade through rapid urbanization. And what that means is cities change a lot, and this is happening globally. And so something I want to talk about, and I also put this in the pre-meeting material, is right to the city. Because I think it's important because yes, cities are sites of neoliberal capital, but they're also sites of resistance. So the right to the city is coined by the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre in reference to the 1968 movement in Paris to demand more from the collective rights of the city. And according to David Harvey, who I would really recommend reading his Right to the City paper after this. And it's like it's linked in the slides, so I think you should be able to access it because the slides will be sent out after. But rather than having cities meet individual needs, which is something that we know is happening because of neoliberalism, because of the prioritization of consumerism, um, the right to the we should instead have right to the city, which guarantees collective power over the processes of urbanization. We should have the power to make and remake our cities to meet collective needs rather than the individual. Um, yeah, and I like this framework because I think this is what the ultimate goal is for Climate Recentered, but also for cities across the world, is that they serve the people rather than the owning class. And so also in just touching on decolonizing the urban. So I mentioned that I'm second generation Bangladeshi settler. So my parents immigrated here and I was born here. Um, And my history is very intertwined with this, even if it's history from a long time ago, my ancestral history. Um, because again, city making and urban planning rapidly changed post-industrial revolution. But the industrial revolution would not be possible without the deindustrialization of Bengal and the colonies of the British, and also extending colonies of the Dutch and the Portuguese and all of these. Hmm. I'm a restorative justice. Yeah. Okay. I will definitely look at this book later. Thanks for sharing. Um, Bengal before colonization was, well, I don't believe in nation states, but it was the richest nation in the world and it had a quarter of the world's trade, and I think like a fifth of the world's GDP. And because it was producing something called muslin cotton, and it was said to be a cotton that was lighter than air. Then, during the Industrial Revolution, one of the primary things that was being produced was cotton. However, it was a very specific kind of cotton that was made from one type of plant. And to prioritize the British economy over the South Asian economy, the British actually destroyed all of the looms that were used to make the muslin cotton. And also, the story goes that they broke the thumbs of all of the weavers. And then Bengal became a raw producer of goods. And this is also true of other colonies across the world. So cotton is very intertwined with colonialism and enslavement. And so when I talk about decolonization and decolonizing the urban and decolonization on Turtle Island, I think it's important to note that decolonization is a global process. And so that's why I always like to introduce where I'm from and my lineage. It is a privilege that I know what my lineage is because it is a global issue. Um, because colonization is a global issue. Um, Yeah. And then cities following the Industrial Revolution became the focal point of the economy. And again, with decolonization, reservations have been intentionally distanced from city life, forcing urbanization of indigenous communities in exchange for access to services. Indigenous people can be viewed as separate urban spaces, but in reality, it was forced exclusion that kept them separate. And so there's a lot to unpack here on decolonizing the urban, neoliberalism, and indigeneity. Um, yeah, I think. Okay, and then quickly I'll just touch on neoliberalism in the city and then we'll take a break. So I mentioned Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and so neoliberalism on the rise. And something that's this is a very important link that I'm trying to make now is because one of the results of neoliberalism is austere governments, governments that don't prioritize social services. And so what that means is that national governments have given power to provincial governments, and then provincial governments end up giving more of their responsibilities to the local levels. And so it's trickled down, meaning that cities have to fight within their own means. And a lot of the times they have to do really like they have to deal with issues that are a lot bigger than what they have the capability to do. Um, and like arts and things get cut, profit gets prioritized. During 2008, like you can really, really see this really take place. Like there's some really nasty examples in the States and in Canada also. But there's like one example of this prison in California that started making its prisoners pay to be in prison. That doesn't make any sense. Um, and so you can really see, and yeah, that's neoliberalism ends up making cities have more responsibility and they end up having to deal with things that are a lot bigger than them, like homelessness and houselessness. That's not something that should be dealt with at a municipal level, but in reality it is. Um, and so because governments have more power locally, it means local organizing is equally as important. Um, okay. Any questions before we take a little break? Yes, and then why mutual aid is essential to climate justice. So again, talking about the urban and the local, and something I realized I like as I was writing this is I want to make it clear. Oh, sounds good, sounds good. Thank you for keeping track of recording also. Um, is there's kind of this dual link that I'm trying to make clear, which is that yes, we have, sorry, like the cities are sites of neoliberalism and they're sites of colonization and capitalism. Um, but at the same time, what is so important is local organizing, and cities are still a really good avenue, I think, for us to practice decolonization and to come together and practice right to the city planning. Um, and mutual aid especially. And so like I don't want you guys to take away from this that like, oh, everything sucks. More so that there are solutions that we have and we have like we have what we need for our solutions. It's just we're not gonna get that from the government when we're in a neoliberal state. And a lot of that will have to come from us. And so I'm like something in Vancouver, like because like this idea of a green city when it comes from like the city itself, like Vancouver is very much sold as like a sustainable city model. And like a lot of things that were sold as climate justice is like electric cars and energy saving buildings, like brand new buildings. But what a lot of these things do is they continue to displace the most marginalized people. Um, who is making the electric cars? Also, what mining has to happen for these electric cars to happen? Where does it have to happen? It happens in the Congo. And like whose black and brown bodies come at the cost of these so these like so-called climate solutions. Um, and these are not justice driven at all. They're new avenues for economic growth that push marginalized people to carry the brunt of the crisis. And so I really want to uplift, like looking for climate solutions that uplift the most marginalized. And fighting for justice at the local level means fighting neoliberalism, colonialism, and capitalism. Um, yes, Marcia, go ahead.
the I think last week was a protest outside Apple store.
Hmm.
I don't know if you see that video. It was a cop that pushed one of our comrades and throw her to the floor, and it was horrible to see. And it's kind of like how you say, like, it's there's so many causes. So you have to choose one because we are enough to I don't know how to say it, what I want to say, but it's kind of like pipelines are causing like a war with indigenous folks, you know. Carney is far right, it's not liberal. So in my country, for example, Chile, we are in election period, and the guy who is from the extreme right is member of the CPAC, that is kind of like Argentinian, United States, and other presidents like are like promoting the conservative model, and I am so scared. So if you know someone from Chile, please tell them to vote against this guy because it's gonna be a terrible thing to have that president.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And yes, the again, like what happened in so-called Vancouver last week, there was a protest at Apple for Black Friday, and it was very much like there was kids there, they were handing out, they're chalking, they were giving out flyers, and like the cops were extremely violent and what did arrested or did, yeah, charged one comrade and then also like threw someone else down down concrete stairs, and like they were okay, but they did go to like the ER to make sure. And so like yeah, we very much see that the state is violent. And so mutual aid is a really good response to that. Okay. Only have 25 minutes left, so I gotta speed through the rest of these. So I really want to emphasize mutual aid is only effective if building towards liberation. And like I mentioned earlier, we can't innovate our way out of the climate crisis. We can't techno solution our way out of it. We can't. Yeah. And like I mentioned Vancouver's city model, it's really like sold as this like very sustainable model. Like Vancouver, it's because we have like the way that the skyscrapers are built, it's like supposed to be in line with the mountains and nature. But it's also like promoting development. And so it's very much this idea of like I think what I also really want you guys to take away from this is uh, asking critical questions of urban planning and like thinking about space. Who is this being built for? And I actually have that on a different slide, but um, yeah, like we can't innovate our way out of the climate crisis. And India's one example of this is like India's smart cities, which I have a lot I could say about the Indian government right now, but I won't. Um, Not about India, about the Indian government. But the smart cities, which there, if you don't know about it, it's there's this idea that India is going to have 100 smart cities. It's very ambiguous about what smart cities actually look like. Um, but this idea of propelling climate justice, and also just like techno innovation, but are often used as a political tool to ingrain neocolonialism and domination. And so I think like we can really think about that. As one example. Like that's not, there's so many other examples in this that we can also talk about. Like, when the SkyTrain's getting built, it's like good public transit. Um, oh, mutual aid example. Thank you for sharing. Um, Good public transit, but like who's getting pushed out to build the new SkyTrain to UBC? And it's not that that's a bad thing. It's not that, but more public transit is a bad thing. It's that we have to constantly fight for the most marginalized. Um, and I've mentioned this again, but decolonization means global decolonization. So understanding like what ways of existing with the land that have been disrupted through colonization, traditional buildings. So like one example of this is like there's a lot of traditional buildings that have naturally like been built to adjust for heating and cooling, but instead we've become overly reliant on like even in cities, like they become heat deserts, right? And so it's counterintuitive to what has been traditional, and a monocropping, mono agricultural practices, things like that. Um, yes. Yeah. Um, and so like speaking of like decolonization and environmental justice in the city, I wanted to talk about environmental injustice in Toronto. Um, I like found a really good report on the environmental justice report from the city of Toronto since 2007, that talks about a few examples. So like South Riverdale, there was a Canada Metal Company that took advantage of the poorer communities and degraded the environment in the 80s. Um, a lot of waste in landfills. Canada has a history of placing landfills in proximity to highly racialized communities. For example, Africville is a really commonly talked about one. I found out the city of Toronto sends waste to a landfill called Greenlane in southwestern Ontario. Also, the city of Toronto just sends its waste to other places, like across the world, which like a lot of places in Canada do, like with recycling. But it's just like it's very interesting because like in the city, you become so removed, like you're so integrated into a supply chain, like you don't even know where the materials that like I don't know where any of the things that have come to build my laptop come from, and like I don't know where my waste goes and things like that. And I think that's something important to think about, but that's a side tangent. And then emissions in industrial proximity for low-income immigrant and racialized populations. Um, so like what I mean by this is like factories that are very high emitters are in proximity to low-income immigrant and racialized populations in South Riverdale, East York, and Mid Scarborough. My family actually first immigrated to Scarborough before they came here. So I feel like I'm linked to Scarborough even though I've like never been there. Um, High polluting factories, Junction Triangle area, are the place in the 90s where plastic factories dumped sewage chemicals into sewage. Love Scarborough. Yes, yeah. And there's a book on it I really like, called Scarborough. What I want to say about these is like why it ends up being in these places also is like these communities are already facing so many crises. It's like what how much can they advocate for themselves? Like, what capacities do they have to advocate for themselves? And like, thankfully, there were community groups that were started for most of these examples that fought back. Um, but it's very, very common for colonial governments to place environmentally harmful institutions and systems near marginalized communities. And again, we have to see like who's getting impacted by what. Like what, yeah, I'll leave it there. And then I'm gonna actually go to this slide because I keep talking about these and these are what I want really for you guys to take away is like who are you serving and who needs to be served, practicing mutual aid and not charity, what already exists, don't replicate or co-opt work that already exists, and like where is your power, what resources can you redistribute? Um, because like mutual aid is only effective if it's building towards liberation. And I've said this, there's another slide on this, but I'm reiterating it. And according to Dean Spade mutual aid projects work to meet survival needs and build a shared understanding about why people do not have what they need. A really common understanding of why people don't have what they need is because the government isn't meeting our needs, and that's because of neoliberalism, because of colonialism, because of neocolonialism. Two, mutual aid projects mobilize people, expand solidarity, and build movements. So mutual aid, like as much as I love a community library, it is only meeting one aspect of this, right? I mean, it is mobilizing people and it's solidarity because it's helping people who don't have access to food readily, but it's very much like an active mobilization project. And mutual aid projects are participatory, solving problems through collective action rather than waiting for saviors. And so, like, I really think these need to be emphasized because, again, it's not charity, it's mutual aid, and it's working together to build collective rights. It's right to the city planning, and it's not falling to the same traps of the neoliberal urban planning agenda where you think that it's not about techno solutionism, it's not about all of these things. It's about working together, it's about community, and it's about the people. And some really good examples that I want to mention of this is the Black Panthers. They, if you don't know, were a group in the 70s that was a armed group of Black folk in, well, I guess all across America. But one of the largest projects that they did was free breakfast and like a lot of their community. Because again, like what said earlier, like you can't worry about the climate if you're hungry. So what they did, well, they didn't care about, it wasn't climate, but like you can't meet your community needs if you're hungry. You can't do so many things if you're hungry. And so what they did is they had breakfast programs. And this was such a threat to the state, that the FBI quite literally urinated on breakfast goods that were supposed to go to the breakfast program. The Black Panthers have since dismantled, but breakfast programs across America are now instituted because of them. They also instituted sick or like built sickle cell clinics in for their community because they noticed it was something impacting their community. Um, and then something that I was reading about in Toronto was just like the AIDS response because again, like the government very famously was not caring about something that's affecting predominantly the queer and gay community. And so these people mobilized themselves. They acted in solidarity. They built a movement. They did something that they needed for them, and it was by them. There was a lot of talking. But I think like I even hesitate saying like what I do is mutual aid because like I think we are meeting community needs, but like I always want to keep like like a check on myself because I feel like mutual aid is something that's very easily said and like thrown around, but it really has a very deep meaning. Um, and when it is done right, it's revolutionary. Um, yeah. And so I think mutual aid is very important. And like lastly, I just want to touch on, we can do this on the whiteboard and also in the chat, but like when we were doing this project in Surrey, we were very centered around the idea of if you could build anything in your city, what would it be? And I'd love to hear your guys' responses. Yeah. So that is the end of my presentation, but I really want to come back to these takeaways because I want to reiterate. I know I've reiterated, but I think it's important. Um, When you're organizing at the local level, we know how important it is to organize at a local level because it has a big impact because so much of our quality of life is determined at a local level. Mutual aid is really, really important. And also like in organizing, understanding who you're serving, who needs to be served. Um, what already exists and where is your power. And I think I should have included this, but um, at what cost and like who is the most impacted by the work that you're doing? I think is also a really important question to ask yourself because, again, with things like techno solutionism, whose black and brown and racialized bodies are getting impacted? Um, yeah, and let me see if there's any more chat. There's so many things open. Um, making available more free public spaces for community building and to create and implement community projects. Oh wait, I already read that, but I'm reiterating it. Um, More places to be active, sports fields and recreational spaces. Yes, very cute. And I really appreciate all of you for coming here and listening to me talk for an hour and a half. That's a long time to listen to me talk. Um, Yes, the paintings are so cute. I really, really hope you guys enjoyed it and took value in it. I did include Climate Recentered into a link in I think in this. Um, but yeah, feel free to follow me on Instagram. I think it got posted with this. And thank you to Suit so much for like dealing with all my tech issues and having and giving me this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it.